morning. Welcome to the Los Angeles World Affairs Council and Town Hall. I'm Kim McClary, President and CEO, and it's my great pleasure to welcome you all to today's program. And thank you all for your ongoing viewership and support. For our members, we are scheduling a number of special exclusive events starting in July. And if you're not yet a member, please consider joining our community of thoughtful and civic-minded individuals passionate about discussing domestic and international affairs. Just click on the membership tab on our website. It's easy to join. For those of you who would like to ask Mr. Abernethy and Dr. Lowenthal questions today, there's a control panel on the right-hand side of your screen where you can type in your questions. Jessica DeGanzik, our Vice President of Events, will be managing your questions during the Q&A portion of today's program, which will start in about 35 minutes. It's now my great pleasure to introduce today's program, Latin America's Changing International Role, a conversation with Abe Lowenthal, who is Professor Emeritus of International Relations at the University of Southern California, moderated by Robert Abernethy, Chairman, American Standard Development, and a longtime board member of the Council Town Hall. We're so happy, Bob, that you're moderating yet another program. We're looking so forward to it.
Thank you, Kim. We very much appreciate, all of us do, your leadership, your talent, your smarts, your enthusiasm, which you've been devoting to the council and to Town Hall. You know, Town Hall and the Los Angeles World Affairs Council have been contributing to discussion of policy, both domestic and international, since 1937, which is slightly before I was born. And I have had the privilege of being a member of both since I think about 1969 or 1970. But we have with us today somewhere between 400 and 500 of our membership and friends, mostly from around Southern California, for our discussion this morning. I'm a little bit perplexed because I don't know what to call our guest: doctor, professor, president, scholar, author, mentor, advisor. I mean, I'm confused. But anyway, those are accolades that he has well earned, each and every one of them, and he deserves them. And I know, for instance, on the author, he's now, I think, at least 14 books, maybe more, and more than 100 articles in professional journals in his lifetime, and in newspaper articles and pieces. I know the number is over 200. He's mentored a lot of students at both USC and other places and across the country. He's advised presidents and foreign ministers of countries in Latin America. So I think I'm going to solve my problem by just addressing you, Abe, as Abe, rather than trying to worry about the plethora of other ways I could address a distinguished record of your life that I've had there. I'd like for us to pretend that there was a third seat here with us this morning, and that it was occupied by Joe Biden. You and I know that he has four principal concerns that are driving his work these days. The COVID problem, both in the United States and across the world, the bringing back the economy for all Americans, climate change, and the immigration, and I guess what I more correctly describe as really race relations in America. So if he were here in this third imaginary chair this morning, how would you advise him on what he should do and what he should not do, and why?
Wow, that's a big question. First of all, thanks to the World Affairs Council Town Hall and to you, Bob, for this invitation and the opportunity to talk with you, with others listening in. President Biden has lots of things to do and to worry about in both domestic and international affairs. If I were asked the question you were asking, I assume it would be largely around what ideas I might have or advice I might have on relations with Latin America, rather than his whole agenda for everything he has to face. The first thing I'd probably say is that as far as Latin Americans are concerned and the interests of Latin Americans, the most important thing that Joe Biden can do is be an effective president for the United States and for the interests of the American people, to confront and deal intelligently and positively and inclusively with the real central issues facing the United States, which go even beyond the big agenda that you were discussing. But beyond that, and turning to the four things that you mentioned, the pandemic, the return of the economy, the issue of climate change, which is a fundamental challenge to the whole globe, and the questions of both ethnic and racial relations and immigration and their intersection. I think you've nailed what the central issues are that Latin Americans would care about in terms of the relationship with the U.S. On the pandemic, I don't know whether everybody realizes, it's important to point out that the effect of the pandemic has been worse on a per capita basis in Latin America than anywhere else in the world. And it has really been devastating and continues to be devastating. And the responses of government, which have been uneven around the world, and we've had our own problems in the United States, but they've been particularly ineffective in most of Latin America. Some of the reforms of the role of the state that we think of as positive because they've engendered greater, faster growth of the economy by getting rid of some excessive state regulation and putting more power into the hands of the private sector to expand production and so on, all of which is to the good, have had the unfortunate and unintended side effect of weakening the capacity of governments and the state in many Latin American countries. And they really have not had the wherewithal, the experience, the personnel, the technical capacity to respond in a number of countries. And it's really been quite frightening in places like Mexico, Brazil, Peru, and others. And it's getting worse again in Chile, which actually had looked like it was responding well. So there's a problem there. And it's also a shared interest between us in the United States and people in Latin America, because as is very clear from state to state in the United States, you know, you can't rope yourself off and figure that you've solved the problem in your state and everything's fine now, because of the nature of how economies work, how travel works, and so on and so forth, and the nature of contagious diseases. You really have to deal it throughout the Western Hemisphere and even beyond that to get a grip and hold on the pandemic, even in this country. So it's a vital shared interest, and President Biden, I think, has that in mind and has been trying to work with Latin Americans on the vaccine delivery and on some of the aspects of making sure that there is an effective response. In terms of the economy, rebuilding and re-strengthening the American economy after the pandemic, reopening it in a safe and secure way, re-expanding employment, and moving back to a more normal state of the economy is a vital matter for us in the United States. It's also a vital matter in Latin America that the US economy re-expand, because many of those countries are so dependent in their economies on trade with the United States, on exports to the United States, and to markets that have been very significantly reduced by the pandemic. Climate change is, of course, a universal challenge, recognized more each year. In some countries, it's taken longer to recognize it than in others, and in some periods, it's been slowed down. The whole question of the future of the Amazon, for example, is a major question when it comes to climate change. And the attitudes of the current Brazilian government have been very much behind in terms of recognizing the relationship between the Amazon's future and the protection of against climate change. And this is a question in several other countries. This is something that, with the help of Special Ambassador John Kerry, the former Secretary of State, the U.S. has turned under Biden its attention to global climate change in a very vigorous way since the inauguration of Biden. And Latin America and cooperation with Latin America and ways to deal with the governments of both Brazil and Mexico, which have a kind of retrograde view on climate change under their two presidents, Bolsonaro in Brazil and Andrés Manuel López Obrador, AMLO in Mexico, finding the ways softly and diplomatically to help move the policies in those countries toward a more cooperative approach has been a real challenge, and I think it's beginning to pay off.
Speaking about Brazil, and I think you hit on an important point about the Amazon forest there. Brazil has perhaps the second highest number of deaths from COVID from any country in the world. Also, Latin America has become, its biggest trading partner has become China, which is sort of done away with our accolade in that regard, being the biggest trading partner for a long while. And there's been a huge amount of investment on China's part in, I guess, Brazil, Ecuador, and Venezuela. I think the figure is, you could correct me, I think as of a couple of years ago, it was like $90 billion of Chinese investment in the Brazilian arena. But how would you advise the president to handle these issues with Brazil, the question of the Chinese influence and also the question of the number of COVID cases that are there? What can he do?
Well, in terms of COVID, I'm not an expert on public health in terms of exactly what you can do beyond expanding the vaccination programs and having increased testing and increased vaccines and providing on an emergency basis assistance to hospitals and public health facilities to deal with a much greater number of people who need help than the facilities call for. And we faced that problem early on in the pandemic in New York City, for example, and the government responded by sending a hospital ship and converting a ship into a hospital and so on. And there may be, ways to cooperate with Brazil and other countries on an emergency basis. I think the big question you ask is about China. And it's a complex question, because one thing is the expansion of trade between various Latin American countries and China, and to some extent a displacement by trade with China of trade with the United States, although it's not always a perfect correlation. But certainly China has become, as you say, the principal trading partner of Brazil and of several countries, mainly in the southern part of South America. This is something that has been developing for some time. It is really, it has to do with the comparative advantages of the Latin American economies and of the Chinese market. The Chinese market, as China's economy has continued to expand for so many years, needs raw materials of various kinds and agricultural products of various kinds that are the principal export commodities from countries like Argentina, Chile, Brazil, and it's kind of a natural expansion, which has been in the interests of Latin America and in the interests of China. And I think that aspect of it hasn't really been threatening to the interests of the United States, because it's not a matter of, we have we have important markets for our various agricultural commodities. We haven't run out of markets for those, and similarly with respect to our mineral exports. But most of our exports are in fact manufactured, and indeed most of it in very complex manufactured products, and that's really not what the China Latin American trade is about. Certainly there's been significant strategic investment by China in Latin America, as you mentioned, and you singled out 3 countries. And there's also been substantial investment in other countries that you didn't mention. Some of it is really of a straightforward economic basis, where there's business to be expanded in countries like Brazil, and there's a need for international finance, and there's more capacity at this point for China to invest in some of these things, and particularly what it has to do with commodities, minerals, petroleum, etc. It fits with China's need to assure those commodities coming in. You mentioned Venezuela. Venezuela used to mean one thing when it came to economics: petroleum. The economy was overwhelmingly petroleum. It still has been, over many years, much more dependent on the export of petroleum than on anything else in the economy. It has not diversified the way Brazil or Chile or Argentina have. And China needs to assure itself of sufficient energy supplies, just as it has been an important part of the United States foreign policy. The United States is much more involved in the Middle East than it would be if it weren't for petroleum. That's been the basis for so much involvement. And we've had increasing ability to develop petroleum in our own territory through fracking and so on and so forth, and through development off the coast of South America, where there's been a great expansion. The Chinese put a lot of investment into Venezuela as a way of expanding access to petroleum. Eventually, the Venezuelan petroleum industry became less efficient. The maintenance wasn't kept up. The sanctions against them made them even less reliable as a supplier. The Chinese actually cut down on their expanded investment. Their main economic interest in Venezuela more recently has been to assure that they get paid back for their investments, and particularly that they get paid the interest on the loans, which Venezuela was kind of not keeping up with. The question of Chinese interest, that's a complicated question. There are some people who think if China has something going on in Latin America, that's automatically a threat to the United States. Well, I think that that's an exaggeration. If there's some trade between China and Latin America that helps the Latin American economies, and the Latin American economies become more prosperous and therefore trade more for the kinds of things that the United States sells, That's good for the American economy as well as the Latin American economy, as well as the Chinese economy. And it's the same as whether you're trading with Germany or France or anything else. Of course, where there are strategic commodities involved, like lithium, rare earths, which are important for special technical uses, or sort of monopoly positions in different minerals or supplies, there are other issues. And then there are the issues of high tech and what it can be used for and so on. And those become security issues. And they're really not central to the U.S.-Latin American relationship, I think.
To what extent, Abe, are you worried about the part of the investment that the Chinese have made in Ecuador and Venezuela and Brazil that has resulted in the purchase of large-scale facial recognition systems for distribution throughout those countries?
Facial recognition?
Yes, keeping track of your constituents.
Well, I'm not sure how much facial recognition equipment there is in Ecuador or Venezuela. I'm not well informed on that. What is your source on that?
Well, the various publications said there's been a large trade from China to those three countries in the kind of equipment that is being used in Western China, that a lot of people that advocate for democratic regimes and democracy are particularly worried about and concerned about. So I don't know how to evaluate what use may be actually implemented and how well in those three countries of that, but it is a concern, I think, to a number of us who are interested in the preservation of democratic institutions and worry about the, I think, recent phenomena that's developed around the world, that we have a greater competition between democracies and autocracies than I've seen in the last 20, 25 years, where that's more at risk, that competition is more at risk. And we even are having that kind of competition internally in countries in Europe like Hungary and to a certain extent in the United States. So the widespread application of this type of information allows governments to track and control individuals and their movements is concerning to me, at least.
Well, I'm really not the right person to discuss that issue with. I watch a British detective series on television through the streaming programs, and I'm always fascinated by the fact that no matter what crime is committed, the first thing they do is to look at the videos that are omnipresent in London at every street corner and in every store and so on and so forth, and see whether the camera will give them some clue as to who was entering the place just before the murder was committed, and so on and so forth. So there's a lot more of that going on in the UK than I realized, and I'm not sure how much goes on in the United States. But technology in general, whether it's video cameras or facial recognition or many, many other aspects of technology, they are things that can be used for beneficial and important purposes, like detecting crime and pursuing criminals, and for deleterious purposes like intimidating voters and so on and so forth. I think it's a complicated question, one that I don't know enough about to make very intelligent comments on.
I would like to go back to an earlier part of your life and just to inquire about some of the things that influence your decision making and influence the success you've had in life in many of the ways that I've touched briefly on. But I know that back in the 30s, your family was pretty much in Germany. And I kind of imagine, as I sit here, a big round conference table in Berlin, where on the left half of it, where your father's relatives, and it was populated almost entirely by rabbis. And the right half of it was your mother's and in-laws relatives. That there were no rabbis there, but they were makers of things, producers, manufacturers of things. And you wound up in neither place, neither a rabbi nor into the industrial production arena of life, but came, your parents came to the United States and fled what was that terrible, terrible set of things that happened in Nazi Germany that caused a lot of people to leave it. And they came, and I guess they came to live in Cape Cod. Later on, you went to school at Harvard. You got a bachelor's degree there. You went on to get I think, a master's degree in public policy or something like that, and then went on to get a doctorate in international relations, or at least in work in fields that are close to that. You know, and I don't know of any family in America that has as many deep connections with Harvard University as yours. I mean, you have brothers and sisters and cousins and everything that are all been wrapped up in the history of Harvard. As a matter of fact, I understand you have a not too distant cousin who was once chairman of the board of overseers, which is the main governance body of Harvard University there. And yet you chose not only not to choose the rabbi side of the table or the production side of the table, but having all that tremendous connection with Harvard University, you chose for the latter half of your adult life to come to the West Coast to sort of divorce yourself from that university, and have done amazing things at the University of Southern California and you know, and other universities in California. So talk to us a little bit about the major decision points in your life and how you navigated through this labyrinth that I've sort of described. And you might also include what your father told you the day you were bar mitzvahed.
Wow. Well, it's true. My parents came from Germany. When Hitler arose, threatening the Jews of Germany, their siblings all left Germany in 1933, 1934, and went to the United Kingdom and Palestine for the most part. They wanted to stay. They had family reasons to stay, and they made every effort to stay in Germany. But after the Crystal Night of 1938, the pogrom, the destruction of all the synagogues of Germany in one night, and the imprisonment of a number of people, my father went into hiding, and they got out to Switzerland and then to the United States, and turned the page and left New York City, where they landed like everybody else, because they couldn't really imagine remaining with a group of German Jewish refugees in Washington Heights, New York, all of whom had suffered the same horrible situations, and were talking about it with each other night and day. They wanted to get away from that and to start anew. And so my father talked to people and got a job on Cape Cod with a group of 25 families in Hyannis, and started a different chapter of life. And I'm blessed that I was brought up really with very little awareness of how terrible the situation was in Germany, and with a very optimistic temperament and not scarred by that period, with wonderful parents. I did go to Harvard as an undergraduate. I certainly didn't have any family relationships with Harvard or any family history of Harvard at the time I went to school. You mentioned somebody in my family being former chairman of the board of Harvard University, and you're right that in my extended family, my first wife was related to and bore the same last name as Judge Charles Wazansky Jr., who was a federal judge in Massachusetts, the predecessor of a friend of yours in the senior role in the district courts in Massachusetts, Judge Wolf. And he was somebody who was very involved in Harvard, and that played a role in my life. You're right that I came on two sides of my family, from a rabbinic tradition on the one hand, and from an entrepreneurial business situation in the textile business on the other, and I didn't really choose either. But in a way, and friends have said this to me, one of them, for example, always calls me his rabbi. And he says, you may not be ordained, but you have some of the characteristics of a rabbi. You tell stories, you have important moral values, you are sort of motivated by social concerns in the way that the rabbis teach. And then I have not ever gone into business, but as you know, Bob, I've played an entrepreneurial role, just not for profit. You have to be pretty stupid to use your entrepreneurial abilities without making a profit. But there are some personalities that get a kick out of that, and I'm one of them. I get a kick out of the institution building role. You mentioned leaving not only Harvard, but the East Coast establishment institutions, the Council on Foreign Relations, the Woodrow Wilson Center, the Brookings Institution, Princeton University, Brown University, all the places that I had connections for California. That was a very simple decision, which is to lead with the heart. I fell in love with a wonderful woman, and she was divorced in Santa Monica, California, with a joint custody arrangement for her two children, and a legal agreement between herself and her former husband that neither of them would leave Santa Monica until their two children graduated from the public schools of Santa Monica. So if I wanted to pursue that possible relationship, because we found each other in Washington in a year that she spent there, if I wanted to pursue that relationship, I needed to base myself in Santa Monica. Not even Los Angeles, Santa Monica specifically, because that's the only place I could really court her. So I was very lucky to get a job at USC. I had the PhD, which is an indication that I thought of myself as somebody who was going to have an academic career and be based at a university. I actually had not been a full-time university professor before I moved to USC, and I had to learn how to do that. But it was a challenge and interesting and fun. And I was able to keep up some relations with the Wilson Center and the Inter-American Dialogue in Washington, and therefore to sort of have a bi-coastal life, which is in turn assisted by keeping a relationship with Cape Cod. So there's always a possibility of spending part of the year on the East Coast. I really feel extremely lucky in how my career has evolved. I'm a great believer that an awful lot of life is serendipity, luck, like the luck that caused me to find Jane and to move to California and start a different phase of my career. A lot of life is serendipity. I tell my students, a lot of life is serendipity. Be prepared for that. But serendipity happens to those who are prepared for it and looking for it. I think Pasteur said that invention comes to the prepared mind. And so there's a little bit of the relationship between luck and sort of understanding where there's something could be done that requires a little bit of effort. And that's exactly the way you operate in the business world, I'm sure. There's always a little bit of both.
I just wanted to reflect, I know the Talmud says that study is greater than action because it leads to action. And I wanted to take off from there to take a look a little bit at your entrepreneurship. I know that back in around 1982, you got together with a friend of mine that I had served about a decade on a board with, a fellow who had many years before started a little company in Rochester, and he named it Haloid, the Haloid Photographic Company. And he grew it for a number of years, and he changed his name to Xerox. And the person I'm talking about is Saul Lenowitz, who later became an ambassador to the Organization of American States. And he also was very instrumental in Latin America in helping Jimmy Carter negotiate the new treaty we had on the Panama Canal with Panama, which resulted in the U.S. drawing back a good bit from its participation in the management and ownership of that canal. But you, I don't know whether you corralled Saul, or Saul corralled you, but together the two of you founded the Inter-American Dialogue, an organization which exists today with a great deal of prominence. Tell us a little bit about why you did that and what you were hoping to achieve in the founding of the Inter-American Dialogue and what it's done through today.
Thanks. I'd be glad to, and I'll try to be concise because I could be tempted to take the whole rest of the interview talking about Saul Lenowitz and the challenge and pleasure of working so closely with him. He was an extraordinary guy with a tremendous capacity to listen and to be sure that he was listening to the people that knew the most from different angles about whatever the subject was, whether it's the Panama Canal or any of a number of other things, and to listen carefully and figure out what the points in common were from people among people with differing perspectives, and where the places were to build and to build on consensus and make forward progress. I learned a tremendous amount over many years working closely with him. First in the mid-1970s, when he chaired the Commission on United States-Latin American Relations, popularly known as the Lenowitz Commission. I was a consultant to that commission, and over the course of the commission, which really lasted over a couple of years and put out 2 reports, which were very influential on the formation of the Carter administration's Latin American policies. Over those years, I got to know him well and to learn a great deal about the policy-making process and about how to think with people of differing points of view about issues. And it really shaped the rest of my career and life. As part of the way it shaped me, it led me to first develop a proposal and get the funding to establish the Latin American program of the Woodrow Wilson Center. And Saul Lenowitz was helpful in thinking out how to do this most effectively, and he participated in that program quite a bit. That program was established in 1977. In 1982, as part of my work on that program, I took a trip to South America, one of many I took, and I was struck by practically all the people I was talking to in South America were worried about their relations with the United States. They believed that the government in power in Washington at that time had forgotten about South America and was only really interested in the civil wars of Central America and Nicaragua and El Salvador and so on, and was not paying attention to what was going on in South America. And they basically asked me, go back to Washington and tell that to people because they need to hear it. So I went to Saul Lenowitz and said, this is something everybody is telling me. He says, well, I haven't taken a trip to South America for quite a while, but I've got friends there and they come by and drop in to see me here at the law firm and they tell me the same thing. So what are we going to do about it? And within a few minutes, we developed an idea for a conference bringing to Washington some of the best, most articulate people of differing points of view, different sectors, different countries, different generations and genders, bring them to Washington to have a discussion with counterparts in the United States about what's going on in South America and what US policy ought to be and so on. So we brought people to Washington for a weekend conference. And the weekend conference was so scintillating, so sparkling. There was so much content there that before the weekend was over, we had an uprising. Hey, we're not going to just have one meeting and go home. We want a commitment from the Wilson Center that we'll come back again and continue the discussions on the basis of some staffing out of some of the issues and put out a report, because people need to hear this message. So people volunteered for this. We put together a second meeting and a report. We had to call the report something. I didn't want it, I said to Saul, I don't want there to be a third Linowitz report. People will get it confused with Linowitz Report 1 and Linowitz Report 2. This should be something that stands on its own. He said, you're right. What should we call it? I said, well, why don't we call it what it is, an inter-American dialogue? Because that's what it was, an inter-American dialogue. So with that little seed, we then moved not only to put out this report, but to get funding to establish an ongoing think tank on Latin America in Washington, aimed at contemporary policy issues, aimed at bringing together people of different points of view, not just one point of view, but with some core commitments, like a core commitment to fundamental human rights, which you were mentioning earlier, and a fundamental commitment to trying to improve prosperity and equity. You know, principles that we could all embrace, but looking at it from different standpoints. So we got fantastic people together, and we met every year, then every 2 years, put out reports after all of those. That led to a think tank function, and now the Inter-American Dialogue, which I haven't run since the 1992. I ran it the first 10 years. But in that period from 1992 to the present, it has become, without doubt, the most prominent and respected think tank on U.S. Latin American relations. And the funny thing is, the years go by and the problems and issues become more complicated, and the call on the Inter-American Dialogue for solutions and for information and for analysis that comes from the Wall Street Journal and CNN and the New York Times and the Washington Post and so on and so forth, but also from all over the region, continues to grow. It's kind of amazing to watch it from the perspective of Los Angeles.
Hey, one last question before we go to Q&A. You moved from there to Santa Monica in pursuit of a new love, and you left the Inter-American Dialogue behind, but you came and you kept on with your entrepreneurial leadership, and you formed the Pacific Council on International Policy. You were the principal driver in that, but you corralled Bob Eberroux and Steve Sample and John Bryson and others to help you in that process. I could ask you to talk a lot about that, but I won't because we're under a time constraint. But I did want to ask you one question that relates to the Pacific Council here in Los Angeles and relates to Southern California. What is the role that Southern California should play in global affairs, and what is the role that it should play in affairs to the south, Mexico, Central America, and Latin America there, given the fact that in California here, we have a gross domestic product that is almost exactly twice what Vladimir Putin's total domestic product is for the whole country of Russia. Having said that, there's tremendous economy here. How should Southern California be utilizing that to play a role, and what should that role be in global affairs?
There's not much time to discuss the question, so I'll approach it this way. When I moved to Los Angeles for the reasons I suggested, I was very surprised because I hadn't lived outside of the Eastern Seaboard. I was very surprised at how different the atmosphere was for well-informed, in-depth discussion and analysis of international affairs in Los Angeles compared with the Atlantic coast. In Washington, when I lived there, I would be invited to 10 or 12 different meetings a week on different international issues with people who are highly informed about those issues, just, you know, looking for solutions, et cetera. And it was hard to find a counterpart institution. And so I tried out the different ones. I eventually found myself being invited frequently to the home of a wealthy West Side Los Angeles person, a very respected person, passed away a number of years ago. But he had sort of salons in his living room where he invited 30 people, 40 people, and we had discussions like that. And I thought, I enjoyed them very much, and I thought, how curious that this function is being performed by a private citizen at home to the number of people that can fit in his living room. This is an important function to think about where you are in the world. And by then I had lived in Los Angeles some time, and I thought, you know, Los Angeles is so international. It has such an international population. It has international universities that have tremendous numbers of foreign students. It has Hollywood with such international influence and talent. It has agriculture, which is so international. It has all this going on, but it doesn't really focus on foreign affairs very much. So I started thinking about it, and after a series of accidents and serendipity that is part of that approach to life I mentioned, came to think, yes, we ought to have more attention paid in a systematic way to international affairs in Los Angeles, the kind of work that the Los Angeles World Affairs Council does, the sort of work that RAND does, the sort of work that goes on in a number of places, should be expanded and supported. And we should do that by looking at the following question. In defining the national interest of the United States as the basis of our national foreign policy, should we consider only the point of view of those who live between Boston and Washington, or should we consider the informed view of people around the country? Well, that's an easy question to answer. Well, once you answer it in the affirmative, we should consider people from all over the country. We need to organize ourselves to have a voice. And so we set up the Pacific Council with that kind of a concept in mind. Once you have that concept in mind and you're looking at the world from Los Angeles, you see China and East Asia much more frequently and clearly than you do from Washington or New York. And you see Mexico and South America much more vividly than you do from Washington or New York. And therefore, you should pay some particular attention to trying to focus attention on those parts of the world.
Yours for questions.
Thank you so much. Our first question, the recent elections in Peru and protests in Colombia and Chile seem to signal a coordinated rejection of ineffective policies. How can aspiring students of geopolitics and diplomacy prepare for service in Latin America?
Well, that question was a statement and a question. The statement, I will only say, yes, there are very important signs of protest in the countries the questioner mentioned and others. I'm not at all sure they're coordinated. In fact, I very much doubt they're coordinated. I think they arise out of the circumstances of each of the different countries. And they do respond to some common factors, but that doesn't mean they're coordinated. I would question that. But in any case, the question really bore an indirect relation to the question. The question was how to prepare for work on the issues that are making the world more complex, more difficult in some ways, but with opportunities for change. And what I'd say about that is I envy college students today who are in the position of starting to prepare themselves for a world which is far more knit together by technology and travel and so on and so forth, in which everybody has an opportunity to pay attention to the rest of the world. I would say that the generic advice I would give, because it obviously depends on the individual, on individual circumstances and interests. They may have an interest in human rights, they may have an interest in women's empowerment, they may have an interest in global climate change, they may have an interest in technology and communications. Whatever the interest, you would answer the question a little bit differently. But I'd say the most important thing is first to get some experience beyond your own community, to look for student exchange programs and travel programs and language and culture programs, but also to invest at the same time in understanding your own country. Because I think a lot of the problems in international relations come from taking your own country for granted and not really understanding its underlying dynamics, and then facing other countries. And I would say in my own case, you know, I really understood a lot more about Peru, where I lived for 3 years, coming home, than I did about the United States, because I never really put that kind of concerted effort into constantly asking questions. And one of my pieces of advice is ask questions. Ask questions of everyone you meet and talk to, and ask questions of yourself. One of my most important mentors, a businessman in the Dominican Republic, for whom I worked in a development association for my first job in the Dominican Republic, he told me, he taught me, he said, every day, ask yourself, what surprised me today? It's amazing how much that one tip has helped me in life. Just being conscious of what surprised me today, it tells you something about what surprised you, but it also tells you, why does that surprise me? And that tells you a little about how you're thinking. And there's some things you shouldn't be surprised by, but you are, because your mind hasn't opened itself to that possibility. So I'd love to have the conversation you're imagining on a one-on-one basis, and I do often have a chance to talk with young people, and I enjoy it very much.
Thank you. Latin American countries are often perceived as being oriented toward Asia, North America, and Europe rather than towards each other. Is there something that the region could gain from greater trade liberalization and cooperation on regional issues?
I would say that statement that you just made as the premise of the question was more true 35 years ago than it is now. I think there is quite a bit of trade integration in Latin America, largely on sub-regional basis, in the Southern Cone, in the Central America and the Caribbean, plus the Dominican Republic, et cetera. And a lot is gained by that. It's not a magic pill that will solve all of society's problems, but it gives some advantages to building competitive advantages and to drawing on people who share the same cultural background, the same languages or close languages and ways of working together. I think it takes a combination of intra-regional and interregional North America, South America interaction. The relation among the North American countries, Canada, Mexico, and the United States, is a particular interest. It's a particular opportunity, which has made some progress over the last 25 years. But it has to be coupled also with being open to the rest of the world. And you mentioned Asia and Europe, and I would add the Middle East and Africa and South Asia, and there are increasing links between South Asia and Africa and much of Latin America, and I think that's that's a way of the future. It's also in terms of young people training. I mean, if you can actually open your eyes to, your mind to learning about more than one region, you get a great advantage in a world which that's going to become more and more common.
Now with COVID-19, the number of poor in Latin America will increase by 28.7 million people, reaching the figure of 214.4 million poor in the region. Will the US have to bail these countries out, or will their own government be able to solve this problem?
I would, I again would reframe your question a little. You're absolutely right that the pandemic has had a devastating effect on economies, on employment, and that it can be measured and is measured by economists in the ballpark that you're talking about. That tremendous decline is not permanent. It can be, and in some countries it's already beginning to be reversed. I would put somewhat greater emphasis on what's happened in my lifetime as a professional, which is a tremendous expansion of the middle class in Latin America, a tremendous increase in the number of people who think of themselves as middle class and live a middle class lifestyle, whose parents were certainly in the realm of poverty, in that line that you were drawing about poverty. So I think that the thrust over 50 years has been toward a great expansion of the middle class and toward a reduction of poverty, not an elimination, and not an elimination of really extreme poverty in some places, and not an elimination of some sort of minimal, not acceptable level of income. That, of course, is also true in the United States, where we have significant part of the population that lives in poverty or in conditions that are not really the right level for a society as rich as ours. And so they vary country to country, but some are more like the United States, some are more like the least developed of the Latin American countries. It's not up, the United States does not have the capacity to, as you put it, bail them out. That is to bring their level of economic development to a satisfactory place. We don't have that capacity. It certainly has to be done in each country with the resources and energies they have, as it has been done in other countries. But the real central point is that the United States, with its resources and advantages, including educational and human resource advantages, can play a positive role in cooperation with the people in less developed countries or countries that have suffered greatly and are trying to recover, build back from the pandemic. The United States can be very helpful, not just out of humanitarian motives, though there's nothing wrong with humanitarian motives. Humanitarian motives are what underlie all of the great religions of the world and all of the great culture of the world. It's not something to sneeze at. But it's not just humanitarian motives, it's also self-interest in terms of living in a neighborhood where people have a chance to move forward, have a chance to get education, have a chance to get trained for different economic roles, and to have a better future. I'm, in general, reasonably optimistic that Latin America will recover from this terrible pandemic, and that also the United States will become more focused on equity internally, and that focus will also re-expand our minds toward being good neighbors. FDR, Franklin D. Roosevelt, established the good neighbor policy with Latin America. Nobody has really lived up to it to a very significant extent. Maybe now is the time in history where there's more room for thinking about it from that from that standpoint. And that would be very good, not only for the people of Latin America and the Caribbean, but for their relatives in the United States and for all of the rest of us who are neighbors.
Thank you. Should the US stop importing consumer goods from China to reduce our external debt with China and divert trade to other nations to stimulate their economies that might help them become independent of China?
I think protectionism is a step backward in economic policy. And I think the fact of expanded international trade is a positive aspect for all the countries involved. I think there is a tendency in the air these days that has something to do with a feeling that is there, but is also being manipulated, that we Americans are used to being number one, and we're used to being top dog, and we're used to not having any competitors. And it would be more fun for us if we never had competitors. Well, you know, that's really not the spirit on which the United States was built. The United States was built on learning how to compete and developing new ways of doing things, new technologies, new products, etc. And we're still good at that. And we should still have the confidence that we can do well in an open world economy. Of course, we don't want people to cheat in one way or another, and we don't want Chinese companies to cheat, and we don't want American companies to cheat. And if you just read the newspapers of the last month, you'll find the biggest banks in the United States are being prohibited from participating in the most important lending activity of the European Union because the biggest banks in the United States cheated. And, you know, in other words, it's a little more complicated than thinking that it's all because of the Chinese. We have our own competitive issues. We need to clean up our own house. And I think we'll be better off with continued economic cooperation in the world as a way to make everybody move forward, rather than getting into sort of reprisal and reprisal back and so on and so forth. They tried that in the 1930s, and it turned out to be disastrous.
Thank you. This will be my final question before I turn it back over to Bob. How involved in the Venezuelan government does Cuba continue to be now that both Castros are gone?
I've been working a lot on Venezuela recently. I've just finished writing a major article on it. The Cuban government has been very helpful to the Maduro government in a number of respects, supporting the first Chavez and then Maduro efforts at improved medical care and education for the Venezuelan people, which the Cubans have basically traded for petroleum at barter prices or subsidized prices, and in providing military intelligence and civilian intelligence assistance to the Venezuelan government, which faces its challenges of trying to rule a country in which the significant fraction of the population is against the government, but it also faces national security issues because there are some countries, particularly recent US government, that would like this government to fall, and they protect themselves from intelligence operations to which Venezuela is subject, the way Cuba used to be subject, and the Castros knew a lot about how to deal with that. Cuba does not run Venezuela. That's I hear people, talk about the Cuban influence like the Cubans were running Venezuela. No, I think Venezuela is on its own path, and it needs and receives a lot of Cuban support. And that Cuban support frustrates the United States because we're the ones who they have to protect themselves against in terms of intelligence and counterintelligence. So we're being stifled by that. I think we really should stand back. The approach the United States has taken to Venezuela over the last few years has not improved the lives of the Venezuelan people. It has not toppled the government. It has not even weakened the government, because the government has weakened in some aspects and it's strengthened by having a foreign power to blame for its own mistakes. And that's partly what's gone on. We should stand back and really ask ourselves, what kind of process can get Venezuela out of the terrible situation it's in? Not only with a dictatorial government and with a majority of the people not wanting this government, but also with an opposition that has been ineffective, counterproductive, unrealistic, and too dependent on the United States. Imagining that somehow the United States was going to solve the problem for them and all they had to do was align themselves closely with the government in charge, have a Venezuelan politician be declared president and recognized by the United States as constitutional. I mean, that's what they did. But, you don't have to be that well educated in international relations to have a government that has no control of it, not a square inch of Venezuelan territory, that controls no government programs, that has no army or police, that is in fact not that popular in the country either, and there are polls to sustain what I'm saying, cannot wish itself into being the government of Venezuela, and it cannot expect that the United States is going to send the Marines and the 82nd Airborne to remove the government and put them in, because our public, bipartisan, is pretty tired of that. It didn't work out so well for us in Iraq, and so on and so forth. So we need a different way to look at it, and I think some people are really working on that in Venezuela and in Washington. And part of looking at it is to think about, are there ways, looking forward, in which the interests and future of Cuba could be more aligned with the interests and future of the United States, rather than assuming that they have to be at each other's throats forever. They've been at each other's throats for 60 years. Is there another way of looking at it? And I'll end with this. I think there is another way of looking at it, and that Obama and Raul Castro were working on that. People talk about Obama's initiative toward Cuba as if he dreamt up this idea that the United States could get along with Cuba. No, he had some ideas for sure, but the guy who took the risk was Raul Castro. He went public to the Cuban people, the Cuban Communist Party, to the Cuban Armed Forces, and to all of Cuba's international allies, and said, our future depends on a better relationship with the United States. That's the fundamental fact about Cuba. They aren't going to succeed being at loggerheads with the United States. And they've done a number of things, including the retirement of Raul Castro, the death of Fidel Castro, the change in the leadership structure, which is almost all now people who weren't even born for the first 25 years of Fidel Castro's rule, looking toward a future with a view toward arranging it in a different way. And I think we should open our minds to how to do that while protecting the vital interests of the American people and the human rights of Americans, Cubans, and others.
Wonderful. Well, Dr. Lowenthal, thank you so much. And to our audience, thank you for all of your great questions. Bob and Kim, I'm going to turn this back over to you. Thank you so much.
Abe, thank you. You've been a good friend and advisor for 26 years. The answer to your last question you asked is, of course there is. But thank you. Godspeed. Stay safe. I'd like to compliment all of those who have been with us for the program. I guess there are 400 to 500 people there, many of whom are our fellow members, some of whom are not members. I would like to urge those of you who aren't to pick up the phone after this meeting and call Kim and say, look, make me a member of this organization. It's an important part of the dialogue in Southern California, and we could certainly use and appreciate your membership from each and every one of you who is not yet joined. And Kim, thank you very much again for all your good work that you've given to the council and that you perform every day of the year.
Bob, thank you so much for moderating again. You bring us so many wonderful speakers. Dr. Lowenthal, this was such a pleasure just to get to know you better and understand more about your background, as well as all of your wonderful intellectual international contributions. Thank you so much for joining us today.
Thank you very much to both of you. It's a pleasure. I have great admiration for Bob Abernethy, who is a relentlessly active force behind all sorts of efforts to make things better in different aspects of domestic and international affairs, in health, in the arts and culture, in so many different ways, and a model for what American private sector leaders can do beyond their business role. And I am grateful for the opportunity and wish the best to the organization and to all of the listeners or viewers. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Lowenthal.